I've come out to pay tribute to Jim Gwartney, a good friend, colleague, and exceptional person. We academics often refer to our dissertation advisor as our intellectual father. As graduate students, we'll spend several years learning our craft from this parent who invests countless hours of their time helping us to become better researchers, better teachers, and for those fortunate, becoming better people from learning from our intellectual father. So it's this latter aspect that really drives home the parenting analogy. I'm personally very grateful to have Jim Gwartney as my intellectual father. He encouraged me to study the causes and consequences of economic institutions, an endeavor that has been very professionally fulfilling to me. However, I'm also very grateful for the opportunity to benefit from Jim's just gracious, kind, and loving demeanor, which has had a profound impact on my life personally. So when I decided to go to grad school, I was a former student of Rich Vedder. I asked Rich, I want to go to grad school, where should I go? What's your advice? He said, well, Daniel, you should apply to 10 schools, including Florida State. I don't care what other 9, you're probably going to end up going to Florida State and studying with Jim Gwartney. He's an exceptional person, amazing scholar, and I think the two of you would work well together. Followed Rich's suggestion, applied to 10 schools, ended up going to Florida State, soon began working as Jim's RA. Mentioned that my connection to Jim is through Rich Vedder, so I want to tell a story that most of us are probably familiar with, but it's fun anyways. And in one time before I started at Florida State, I'd been in email contact with Jim, said, hey, Rich told me to get a hold of you. Said, oh yeah, Rich and I are old friends. We've had a number of battles together, including a trip to Russia to meet with Putin before he became president. So they were apparently part of a small convoy invited over by Andrei Lernov to come and educate the incoming administration, a number of economists, government officials on, liberalizing their economy, adopting markets, reducing their tax rates, trying to implement property rights. Apparently during their trip, one of the stops was to give a lecture at the former communist headquarters in Moscow, and apparently all of the cabinet level officials were required to attend this as part of their re-education training. So they spent, I think, 2 weeks over there, and their trip culminated with what was described to them as a modest lunch with President Putin. And apparently Russian modesty involves beluga caviar. I guess the Russians have a different impression of modesty than what I would have expected. So they got to spend, a lunch with Putin, a very intimate setting, and apparently at the end of the lunch, it was suggested to President Putin that, hey, you implement these reforms, and you'll experience remarkable growth, and maybe in 10 years we can come back and kind of celebrate this when you're in your, I guess, third term as president. And apparently Putin had suggested that. Well, no, I'm going to only serve 1 term. I'm going to implement some reforms and let somebody else take over. Their trip was in spring of 2000. Okay, so here we are about 2 decades later. Apparently 1 term is 18 years. And they implemented, he implemented some reforms. They've had, since their trip in 2000, I looked at the growth rates of Russia, and they grew by a little less than 4% GDP per capita. I kind of tracked their economic freedom scores over this period of time. So they've made some improvements in stabilizing their monetary policy. Had modest improvement in the size of government, but the rule of law and property rights, they've actually gone from about a score of 6 down to about a 4 most recently. So I don't know if Putin remaining president has anything to do with that, but apparently they didn't heed the full advice that they were given on that trip. So back to my experience at Florida State, my first year of grad school, I'm looking around at my fellow Seminoles. It was pretty rough. To borrow a technical term from one of Jim's other students, Bob Lawson, it sucked. That's the title of his forthcoming book about socialism sucking, so I thought I could borrow that technical term and used it here. It's just a lot of math. I expected to come into a lot of math, but it was kind of discouraging because, I like solving mathematical proofs and general equilibrium models as much as the next public choice economist, but I was really hoping to learn more economics. Over the course of my first year and a half, I really questioned whether I would, this was the career for me and whether I could do this for the rest of my life until I got in Dr. Gwartney's Institutions and Development seminar, and we started reading articles that really appealed to me intellectually. Trying to understand really big questions about how institutions, can improve society's performance, as long as another of other kind of measures of human flourishing, like reducing poverty, improving well-being, these sorts of big picture questions that really kind of struck me as being important, and Jim certainly encouraged that through his kind of enthusiastic kind of leadership of the course. So part of this course, we had to read several articles every day and come prepared to talk in a seminar format, and I think our cohort met that semester at 8 a.m. and nobody likes an 8 a.m. class, but I looked forward to getting up at 8 o'clock and coming to discuss these ideas. And he also had an awesome supplementary reading guide. So if you were excited about a particular area of study, then you could kind of delve deeper into the literature. And early on in the semester, I started reading, other articles on that list and identified a topic that I thought needed some more research, namely the effect of economic institutions on income inequality. Talked to Jim about this. He said, I think this is an area that needs some more research. Why don't you write a paper on that? It might actually make a good dissertation topic. So I wrote a paper, ended up getting that paper published. I was still in graduate school, ended up writing a dissertation on the topic, and I've managed to spin 5 or 6 journal articles out of that dissertation. So I thank Jim for kind of encouraging me and guiding me in that kind of process. In addition to kind of influencing my research interests, Jim said he's been a source of encouragement to me personally in a number of other ways. First, Jim is the most humble person I've ever met. I think I heard this from Matt Brown, another one of Jim's former students. He wants to describe Jim as a serial academic entrepreneur. I like that. Jim's been at the forefront of kind of trying to make public choice in institutional economics a part of education, economics education, and that's reflected in the wide success of his textbooks. And he's also had some hand in kind of measuring economic freedom, which has led to a vast kind of research enterprise that's really helped us understand how private property rights and markets really matter for not only prosperity, but a number of other kind of socioeconomic and political outcomes. And he played a small role in that. So despite all of this success, you wouldn't know it in talking to Jim. He's very humble, and I find this to be a very attractive quality of Jim's personality. Some of you might also know that Jim has a little trouble seeing these days. I think many people with that condition would not try to overcome that type of adversity, and I really admire Jim for that. Despite his limitation in that regard, he's still managed to be a highly productive researcher, highly productive teacher, and a highly productive mentor. And just to tell another quick story, when I was writing my dissertation, Jim had the fortunate luck of getting a pretty severe case of the shingles, and I think he struggled with that for about 6 months, but he still read my dissertation chapters, met with me regularly. I remember having to go to his house, and he'd be laying on the couch in obvious pain and discomfort, and and talking to me about the shortcomings of my paper and what I needed to do about them. And I admire him for kind of his ability to overcome the kind of adversity that he's been faced with in life. Jim's marriage to his wife, Amy, has also been exemplar to me. They've been married for, I think, 55 plus years now. 56 years. All right, so they're the sweetest couple that I know. They still hold hands. They still say sweet things to one another. And they're obviously still really in love with one another. And that's been a real encouragement to my wife and I. So we enjoy spending time with them. There's definite positive spillover effects into our marriage from them. And at one point we asked Jim and Amy what the kind of secret sauce to their marriage was. And without hesitation, they revealed to us, Jim said, Amy's my best friend. And Amy said the same thing, Jim is my best friend. So just that we've really tried to adopt that kind of perspective into our own marriage, and it's really paid dividends. And in fact, I will often refer to my wife as best friend, and that's really helped. Been a really useful piece of advice for me personally. Jim and Amy not only love one another dearly, they also extend this love to others. They love their neighbors. I think others will talk about this, but they every year have annual Thanksgiving dinner at their house where they invite students, colleagues, and people from church. Anybody they don't know that doesn't have a place to go, they invite them to their home and they just have a very nice feast. And this is something that they've done since Jim was a graduate student at the University of Washington. I have very fond memories of the Gwartney Thanksgiving traditions, including his annual opportunity to teach economics through the lesson of the Pilgrims adopting property rights and institutions, and that's really the reason that we celebrate Thanksgiving every year. So we've kind of tried to adopt this tradition recently into my own family, where in Dallas we weren't able to make it back to visit our parents over the holidays, so we invited people into our home and definitely shared this. The reason we're doing this is because I was inspired by Jim and Amy Gwartney to kind of be hospitable and loving and open our home. So in closing, Jim's made a tremendous impact on both my professional and personal life. I'm very proud to refer to him as my intellectual father, and I consider him a personal role model. Ephesians 6:2 of the Bible says, honor your father and mother, that it may go well with you. Today, we as his students, colleagues, and more importantly, friends, gather to honor Jim. So thank you for joining us to share and paying tribute to a truly exceptional human being. Thank you.
So it's my turn to provide, be a discussant of Daniel's presentation. I'm Hugo Montesinos. I am incredibly honored to be here as well, from being from Venezuela and having the opportunity to come here and work with Dr. Gwartney on different projects, research projects. I value immensely the type of work he does, and the economic freedom of the world report that he started putting together with Dr. Lawson. And initially coming to work with him was already a great honor. Then getting to know him personally, the situation, I mean, was even better, much better. And so let me see if I can. Okay, this is going. I brought here some pictures. Some mentioned that would be cruel to show some pictures to Dr. Gwartney, but I wanted to show you all what it is like to work with Dr. Gwartney. I don't usually take pictures, but these ones were taken maybe a month ago in in Tampa. And we were working at a paper that we're going to present here. And so that's how we work. I mean, you can see Joe there. We're in our computers, and he is in his computer. And yeah, few scholars have done so much as Dr. Gwartney to measure economic freedom and the impact of that in an unbiased and scholarly manner, and to assess the impact of sound economic institutions in society. Dr. Gwartney has also integrated public choice into the economic curriculum through his textbook, and promoting a balance in the U.S. Economic education for not just market failures, but also government failure. Most importantly, he has been a remarkable human being, co-author, and dissertation advisor. He is an example of virtue, resilience, who does not need to see to have a great vision, and to read, to write, and to do everything that pretty much everybody does. I am fortunate and honored to have worked with him. So I wanted to show you also a little bit of an impact I collected. I'm grateful to Ryan and to Signe Thomas, who helped me collect some of this data. And we show here, this is from Common Sense Economics data, the number of students that have been impacted according to their statistics that since 2012. And it has grown substantially since 2015, particularly from about 5,000 students to about over 75,000 students in 2018. And in the graph, you can see by state. And finally, from the Fraser Institute, I was able to collect the number of citations of the Economic Freedom of the World report. In the last decade, it has grown dramatically, I mean tremendously, from about 200 citations in 2010 to almost 700 in 2017, and it keeps growing. As I mentioned at the beginning, as a citizen of Venezuela, I can see, I mean, we can see, okay, this has grown already, but what I see is that this has a lot more to grow in the years and decades to come. The impact of economic freedom in society, and in our lives, it's in the world, it's fundamental to keep promoting these ideas and these big pictures ideas that Dr. Gwartney always advanced. And finally, to conclude, I wanted to show you one more thing here. In this trip of course, there have been many experiences I have lived with Dr. Gwartney, but trying to keep it up in terms of personal experiences in short, in this trip to Tampa, it was really remarkable to me that we stopped to put gas at a gas station. And so, of course, Amy put on the credit card into this slot, but Dr. Gwartney gets out of the car and helps her put gas, which was remarkable to me. So I took some pictures of that, didn't tell them, but in those pictures, you can see him helping put the gas. So those type of details are those that make him a true gentleman and a remarkable human being. And he does these type of things every day, all the time. So, okay, thank you very much. I'll let to the next person.
So unfortunately, I don't have pictures or visuals to show you, but I do want to say some really nice things about Jim. My name is Brice, and I am honored to participate in this celebration of an incredible economics researcher, educator, innovator, and mentor. I was a graduate student who studied under Jim Gwartney at Florida State University, and I owe so much of my current career success to him as a new hire to University of North Carolina, Wilmington. One need not look very far to find politicians, educators, and religious leaders failing to grasp the importance and benefits of freedoms in markets. These individuals are products of societies that failed to provide an adequate and convincing economics education, and now they are playing important roles in an unfortunate cycle that continues to suppress the prosperity of the very people they are attempting to serve. While many great minds have realized this problem and sat idly by, Jim Gwartney dedicated his life to diligently researching the benefits of freedom in markets, improving economic education, mentoring future instructors and leaders, and playing a significant role in ensuring both elites and the general populace alike have access to these important ideas and evidence to support them. Most of you attending this celebration of Jim Gwartney are aware of the tremendous contributions he has made to economics and education. And for those of you that are not, I encourage you to become familiar with his work and assist in his promotion of freedom in markets. For me, my interest in economics began when I was an undergraduate student at West Virginia University. I was an economics student of Russ Sobel's, who is also studying under Dr. Gwartney and our keynote speaker here today, Randy Holcombe. I was simply taking an economics course to satisfy a requirement for a minor in business administration. And Russ was one of the many students under Dr. Gwartney that left that program passionate about the importance of institutions and public choice analysis. And the lessons that I learned from Russ really challenged my worldview pertaining to the conditions necessary to alleviate poor conditions around the world and the ability of government to efficiently tackle these same issues. So this sparked my interest, and I ended up changing my major from biology to economics. And ultimately, I furthered my studies at a graduate level. And through Russ's direction, I applied to Florida State University, and it was one of the greatest decisions I ever made to study under Jim Gwartney. In my first year of my PhD program as a graduate teaching assistant, I was assigned to assist Laura Holcombe, Randy Holcombe's wife and a fantastic economic educator in her own right, with her principal's classes. I would assist these classes, and it was here that I had my first exposure to the lessons contained in Gwartney's public and private choice textbooks. In this text, it provided an entire chapter on public choice rebuttals to the assumptions that governments could efficiently address market failures. It highlighted the growth of government expenditures and debt and explained several reasons for why this was occurring, including special interest effects in politics, incentives that politicians had to be short-sighted, among other things. This text also dedicated a significant amount of space to explaining the importance of economic institutions, such as protecting private property rights, promoting free trade, and the economic outcomes that this achieves. These are such important lessons that often went unstressed in many textbooks. And with thousands of students every year, as you saw in the statistics that Hugo just showed you, we have thousands of students now every year that are eagerly studying these ideas, and this will forever be one of Jim's lasting impressions on not just the discipline, but society in general. I remember one of Laura's students who stayed after class was so fascinated by this idea of economic freedom, he wanted to learn more. So Laura was really happy to talk with him and mentioned how lucky we were to be at FSU, where an originator of the Economic Freedom of the World Index was located. She said that she was certain that one day Jim would win the Nobel Prize for his contributions in economic freedom and economic education. And I think it's safe to say that everyone here shares the belief that he's deserving of such a prestigious recognition. But even if you don't win the Nobel someday, Jim, I want you to realize that all of us here think this highly of you and understand the important role you have played in the profession with your institutional research and promotion of public choice and institutional lessons in your education materials. To highlight the importance of an economic understanding of institutions, the other day I was listening to an interview with the stepson advisor to the president, Jared Kushner. He was explaining why the current administration advocated for tariffs in response to the existing trade deficit with China. His reasoning was that in his travels around the world, he never heard any foreign leader mention that they wanted a trade deficit. Therefore, trade deficits must be bad, and it is very important to prevent these kind of policies from occurring. And we need to do everything in our power, including tariffs. I heard some laughs. So to anyone in this room, I'm guessing that this reasoning probably isn't very valid. But to him, the interviewer, the audience, this kind of reasoning made sense. Now, Jared needn't look any further than Jim's writings on trade to understand the failure in his policy recommendations. In June of 2000, Dr. Gwartney was the lead economist in writing a Joint Economic Committee staff report on the 12 myths of international trade for U.S. Senator Connie Mack. Myth number 6 in this list: a trade surplus is good and a deficit is bad. With an understanding of foreign exchange markets, Jim writes, a trade deficit will occur when the U.S. economy is offering investors such attractive options that foreigners are investing more in the United States and buying more assets than Americans are investing abroad. Again, it is hard to see what is bad about this situation. Would we prefer that our economy be in such poor shape that investors, domestic as well as foreign, had better options elsewhere? End quote. In fact, myths 7 through 10 on this list also address the incorrect view that trade deficits hurt our economy, while number 3 addresses the actual harms of tariffs. So the current administration's policy is to impose a policy that creates economic harm in order to address a situation that actually is not even a problem in the first place. Examples such as this highlight the importance for voters, politicians, and everyone to understand these economic issues. And this is why Jim's work to incorporate institutional and public choice analysis in his textbooks, which are utilized in high schools and colleges and used by thousands of people across the country, is becoming so impactful. For example, every high school in the Metropolitan Statistical District of Detroit is utilizing Gwartney's Common Sense Economics tests, and this is just a small sample of the lives that are being changed with these materials. Beyond being a great researcher and educator, Jim is also very hospitable. As you heard Daniel mention, he not only was very welcoming in his office, where he worked at the Stavros Center for Free Enterprise and Economic Education, where Hugo and I and Daniel at one point also worked, but he was frequently carving out time out of his busy schedule for students, but he was hospitable at his home as well. Daniel mentioned that he'd often have people over for Thanksgiving. And in fact, every year, Jim and his wife, Amy, they invited everyone from the FSU Economics Department to join his friends and family in church for a Thanksgiving feast. For graduate students, and I was one not that long ago, this was particularly nice since many of us at the time did not have family that lived nearby at the time, nor the means to leave Tallahassee. And he treated everyone as if they were his family. And this generosity and hospitality is something that we all admire, not just Daniel, not just the speakers, but everybody that had the opportunity to spend Thanksgiving and other opportunities with Jim and Amy. In true Gwartney fashion, he found a way to turn such an event into a learning experience about the importance of institutions. Before we dig into our delicious meal, he would tell the story of the first Thanksgiving feast and how private property rights played such an important role. He was always an educator first, and I won't spoil this wonderful story for you. You might just have to go to Tallahassee and join Jim and Amy for Thanksgiving. And please don't tell Amy that I invited all these people without her permission for Thanksgiving. Today, my walls are lined with thank you cards from students who really enjoyed learning about institutions in my own development classes and principles classes, and many of which took this appreciation and curiosity and went on to continue their studies at a graduate level. While they might not realize it, each of these students owes so much to Jim. Without his writings, his textbooks, his mentoring of me and others, so many students would have a poor understanding of the world and, dare I say, less interesting and important career trajectories for those who have decided to dedicate their lives to the promotion of freedom. You didn't just touch the lives of your students, you also touched the lives of hundreds of people that you have instructed and those that have been touched by them, and the thousands of lives that go beyond the classroom. Because of Dr. Gwartney, thousands of students right now are learning about public choice economics and institutional analysis, and almost certainly would have never heard of these important perspectives without Jim's work in economic education. Considering this, along with the dozens of impactful academic journal articles, testimonies, media publications, and other writings, it is so apparent to me that the meaningful and lasting impression that you are leaving on the economics profession and our society in general is massive. On behalf of all of us, I want to thank you for all you have done, and I believe I speak for all of us when I say we look forward to the incredible work you have yet to produce. On behalf of all of us, thank you, Jim.
Hello, my name is Doug Norton. I'm at Florida State University. I first want to thank Dan Bennett for putting this together. I think it's a really beautiful thing, and it's very, kind of a little bit emotional, to be honest, to hear so many people having such great experiences with Jim, who I also enjoy thoroughly. So I'm going to give a talk, I suppose, about the notes on economic education, comments and celebration of Jim. So education, to me, is about the cultivation of the mind to grasp the truth of how things work. The unique challenge of economics education is to help people grasp the unseen. Jim Gwartney has been making the unseen opportunity costs and unintended consequences visible to students for decades. In this short remark, I want to reflect on the attributes of a good teacher and how I see these attributes in Jim. To my mind, there are two parts of a good teacher, personal and professional. These are not completely distinct, but they'll be a useful organizing principle. By personal, I mean how a teacher relates to their students. And by professional, I mean the quality of the case the teacher makes to their students, how the teacher distinguishes between true and false arguments. So let's talk about the personal. A good teacher cares deeply about their students and their subject. Who among us economists, when we've told somebody that we teach economics, hasn't heard somebody blurt out, "Oh, I hated that class. I hated that class." And no doubt there are many reasons for this, but I suspect that their teacher didn't love economics the way that Jim loves economics. Okay. Author Donald Miller has wrote, "Sometimes you have to watch somebody love something before you can love it yourself. It's as if they're showing you the way." Jim's love for economics invites others to love economics too. In fact, this leads me to the next attribute of a good teacher, curiosity. One reason that students may find course material in economics lacking is because it answers questions that they never thought were important to ask in the first place. I think Jim helps to get students on the hook or cultivate their curiosity with big questions. Questions about why some nations are rich and others are poor. He doesn't take his eye off the ball, and he invites students into the wonderment of how vast exchange networks that create wealth hang together with the price system. He reflects this curiosity in his personal conversations too. After a reading, conference presentation, others, Jim is curious to hear about what you think. And he's very interested in having a debate and live dialogue. And by the way, he can't turn it off either, because after going to church with him and going to Panera afterwards and trying to get in under the deadline, they stop serving breakfast at a particular time. We get in there quick, get those breakfast sandwiches. It's like 5 minutes about like what'd you think about the sermon, and then it's like economics. And so yeah, he's always turning it on, and it's I don't think he can turn it off. That he asks other people about their thoughts and takes their comments seriously also, I think, reflects his humility. Arrogant teachers turn students away. Humble teachers who demonstrate an understanding of their students' dignity, invite students into a conversation in common pursuit of the truth. Let's talk about the professional. So we know the power of economics, that it has to explain the world around us, but each of us has to make that case to students. The stickiness of the argument rests on three modes of persuasion: logic, credibility, and emotional appeal. For Jim, there are obvious credentials and accomplishments that lend credibility, but the arguments also pack powerful logical appeal and some emotional appeal too. By using standard economic models coupled with the 1-2 punch of public choice and the knowledge problem, Jim makes compelling arguments about how institutions shape incentives and affect information as well as economic outcomes. While economists are sometimes a little thin, you might say, on emotional appeal, Jim reminds us about the dangers of bad economic reasoning by pointing to interventionist experiences in his writing. And just as a side note, my wife is a pediatrician, and at one point, somebody in my family said to me, "Yeah, you're a doctor, but not the kind that can help anybody." But then I thought of Jim's Jim's discussion about the Soviet experience, and I thought, well, things can go really badly if you get some bad economic advice, right? So while there's a forcefulness in his argument about institutions, there's also humility. In his presidential address to the Southern Economic Association, Jim writes, "During the past 15 years, economists have become increasingly aware that institutional factors exert a strong impact on both level and productivity of investment." And he goes on, but this is the important part. "Some even argue that institutions rule. I'm not willing to defend that position, but I do think it's clear that institutions matter and that they matter a great deal." And I think that this is really telling, because for someone who spent the last 3 decades developing a measure of institutions and tracing the relationship between those institutions on a host of important outcomes, this last line is a statement of humility, to my mind. I believe the statement reveals an acknowledgement that economics is as much about humans as it is the institutions in which humans interact. And this, I think, is also the view that his advisor, Douglas North, had when he wrote in his Nobel Prize address, "The relationship between mental models and institutions is an intimate one. Mental models are the internal representations," thank you, Dan. "Mental models are the internal representations that individual cognitive systems create to interpret the environment. Institutions are the external to the mind mechanisms individuals create to structure and order the environment." So there's an interplay between the humanity of people and political institutions that was evident with Doug North, Hayek, and also Jim. And this interplay is also in the public choice arguments that Jim makes. So when he's talking about the profound effect that Jim Buchanan had on him, he says real world political decision makers, they're neither saints nor benevolent, omniscient social planners. Instead, they're normal, self-interested human beings with a strong incentive to win the next election. And when pursuit of this goal conflicts with idealized efficiency, the former will dominate over the latter, right? On a more personal level, I believe this recognition of a human-centered economics is the reason that, one, Jim so graciously hosted the Economics and Moral Sentiments Readings Group at the Stavros Center from 2008 to 2011, where he humored, but did not suffer, many of my less institutional and more psychological ideas. And in fact, Jim, you're probably the reason that I haven't gone full behavioral. And I'm still like in the economics camp, at least for the most part, right? And 2, Jim was the first to offer to include MobLab, which is a software platform for classroom experiments, in the recommended resources for instructor section of his textbook. And I recall that, I don't know if you have the similar recollection, Jim, but I recall that he liked the idea that MobLab helped to populate our economic models with real people and link their behavior under different institutional arrangements to outcomes. And experience is the most incredible teacher, I think. So his continued exploration of new teaching techniques reveals how he's still searching for compelling ways to introduce economics to students. His willingness to host that Economics and Moral Sentiments Readings Group shows me that it's not all institutions to him. It's also trying to understand the people that are operating inside of them. I think that this curious mind that I was talking about doesn't just extend to finding new techniques for teaching, but you can see it in his students. I mean, at this conference alone, you've got Dan, Hugo, Joe, all presenting about culture and economic institutions. And so there's a willingness to kind of explore the boundaries and get into new kind of arguments. And I think it's all showing Jim's influence. One more note before I wrap up this human-centered approach. Jim is a devoted follower of Christ. Even though economists are admonished to think about changes in prices and incomes and not tastes, right? The Becker, Stigler, de Gustavus, right? Jim also understands there's a potential to have a change of heart. Put another way, there's an opportunity to change how we evaluate what options are desirable. Indeed, this is one reason that Jim, I think, has argued that free enterprise is worthwhile. It helps people to develop non-cognitive skills like perseverance, temperance, and more. And all of this is part of a human-centered approach that makes, I think, economic ideas stickier with our students because it has all the force of logic, credibility, and emotional appeal. Without that emotional appeal, we're presenting students with a two-legged stool. You can't sit on a two-legged stool. So concluding thoughts. It would be a mistake to think that Jim is only interested in faceless aggregates because he has run a lot of cross-country regressions, okay? His understanding of economics is much richer than differences in economic growth across time and place. And this shows through when he teaches students, engages colleagues at lunch, writes for wide audiences, teaches fellow churchgoers about property rights and the Pilgrims at the annual Thanksgiving dinner. He has love for people and economics. His success as an educator stems from that love and the humble and curious way that he approaches to understanding our world. And of course, those of us who know Jim well would also tell you that his success is due in large part to his incredibly supportive wife, Amy. Gotta finish here. So Jim is a model educator, and if he could be cloned and teach economics to the world, there would be a lot more clear economic thinking.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Joseph Connors. I'm also a graduate student of Jim's, and I currently teach down at Florida Southern College. And I'm going to touch on a couple of things of some of the many accomplishments Jim has achieved. And it was funny in the kind of the days leading up to today in this session. We would joke with Jim, and Jim was a little nervous because we really didn't tell him too much about what this session was going to be like. So he had some nerves. So my thought was, Jim, maybe instead we should have just done a roast. And instead of talking about your accomplishments, we could just roast you for about an hour and 20 minutes. Most of us did not do that. But I thought, as I was kind of listening to Daniel speak, Brian and Daniel flipped the order. I thought, maybe we could roast Jim a little bit because Jim spent some time in Russia advising Vladimir Putin, and we saw what happened there. And then, as Brandon was talking about, the widespread use of common sense economics and of how it's just infiltrated the whole Detroit public school system. I thought, man, these are not selling Jim's ideas. We got Russia and Detroit, so maybe these are turnaround stories. So, but I think what I wanted to kind of touch on today is, as most of you know, knowing Jim over the years, many accomplishments, has published a great deal. He, for 2 years, was chair of the Joint Economic Committee of Congress, created the Economic Freedom of the World Index, become director of the Stavros Center, and so forth. So there's a great deal of accomplishments he's achieved, and Hugo touched on some of those with the Economic Freedom of the World Index. But what I wanted to focus on today are kind of two topics. The first is his incorporation of public choice insights into principles of economics textbooks. He was kind of one of the first to do it. And the second thing I'm going to touch on is kind of him as a role model in terms of perseverance in academic pursuits. So, but I'll start with the public choice highlight. So, in 1962, right, Jim Buchanan and Gordon Tullock published Calculus of Consent, and kind of starts the public choice revolution. And as I was kind of writing this paper and kind of thinking through it, I've always kind of come back to this idea that there's two things about the public choice revolution. One, it probably never should have been a revolution, right? I mean, these basic economic thinking applied to collective decision-making of government. And it's kind of, why did it take the economics profession that long to really incorporate that into it? And the second thing is, as revolutions go, right, it hasn't finished. Like it started and so you can kind of see this in the Principles of Economics textbooks. And this is what Jim and Rosie Fike, who couldn't make it, she couldn't make it out of Dallas, but they wrote a paper looking at this, just Principles of Economics textbooks. And many textbooks today still don't even incorporate public choice analysis into the economics of taxation, subsidies, price controls, things like rent seeking, how voters behave, and how voters influence the political process and the incentives in there as well. So in some sense, and I know this is something that Jim has commented on, not that he's disappointed, but when he, and you can correct me afterwards if I'm wrong, Jim, but when, you know, the insights from public choice analysis kind of first came on the scene, I know Jim was pretty excited about it, and he thought, man, this is going to revolutionize everything. And I think when he wrote this paper with Rosie, they kind of realized that, man, this hasn't even revolutionized the principles textbooks. So from his paper with Rosie, I have some of the statistics here. Let's see. So they did an analysis of 23 leading Principles of Economics textbooks. And in those books, only 15 of the 23 covered how the voting process affects political outcomes. Only 13 of the 23 contain any coverage of government failure. Okay? And there were actually 8 of the 23 that either had no or marginal discussion of public choice insights. And so, in some sense, right, the public choice revolution hasn't finished yet. So maybe we'll give it time. The other aspect, this is a bit more on the, well, just kind of getting at Jim's perseverance. When he first decided to publish this book, and I think this is right, Jim, he signed a year kind of delivery timeline with the publisher. He's going to finish the whole textbook in a year. So he got to the end of the first year, and you were probably about halfway done, I think, Jim. And so Jim thought, man, I'm never going to finish this thing. And actually, several of the people have mentioned the influence of his wife, Amy. And actually, it was Amy who prodded him and encouraged him to finish and keep going. So, so again, we see the role of Amy there. Let's see. Oh, yeah. So there's also, so Jim publishes his principles textbooks, becomes very popular, well-used textbook. A little while later, Gordon Tullock, along with Mackenzie, they put out a principles textbook that incorporated public choice insight into it. And so Gordon, in his Gordon fashion, wrote a letter and sent it to Jim and said, well, Jim, I just want to announce to you, I've got a new Principles of Economics textbook out. So I apologize. Your books had a great run. It's had a lot of success, but competition usually brings, quality out. So, I apologize. Yours is going to wane. Mine is going to do better. I thought that was a great story. Unfortunately, when Jim was losing his sight, and this is something I'm going to touch on in a second, that letter was put into some boxes with stuff that ended up getting thrown away. So that letter doesn't exist anymore, but it still remains as a great story. So now the second aspect in terms of Jim being a good role model as an academic is his kind of perseverance under adversity. And in some ways, I kind of think about it as a bit of a kind of a joke story to kind of get the point across. Eventually, when Jim goes to meet our Savior, he'll be standing there with a bunch of other academics, and they'll be talking about their accomplishments. And Jim will be able to say, well, yeah, I did all that, and I did it while blind. So, so he said, but this is kind of kind of an example of his hard work and perseverance, and that being a great example for academics. And the second story actually comes from Randy. Randy might not remember this analogy he used, but in my first year of graduate school at Florida State, I was chatting with Randy about the whole first year process and what you were quoting Bob Lawson about how it sucks. And so Randy had an idea. He said, look, you know what we should do? We shouldn't do this whole first year prelims test thing. We should just put all the graduate students into a swimming pool and then just let them tread water. And the 5 or 6 or so who are left treading water at the end, those are the ones that could continue on through, right? Because they've displayed the perseverance and the hard work, and they love it, and they're really willing to stick it through. So, so that kind of just illustrates the importance of perseverance. And so most of you are familiar with, Jim losing his sight and so forth. Okay. But I guess most of you are less familiar with the skin cancer Jim suffered from or suffered with in the late 1970s. So I think it was in 1977 he was diagnosed with a form of melanoma. And it was pretty severe. So he spent the next 3 years traveling to the Mayo Clinic in Houston for treatment. And I think by the end of treatment, it was pretty dicey. So there's a good chance that Jim was going to die. So he recovered miraculously, and so we're grateful to have Jim. And if we think about that, that's in 1980, right? And so the term we use in baseball when a game goes into extra innings is we get free baseball, right? We get baseball we didn't have to pay for. So in this sense, after 1980, we got free Gwartney, right? And if we think about all the accomplishments he's achieved since then. In fact, most of the things we've mentioned, he's achieved in these discussions. He's achieved since then, and so, and again, his suffering with skin cancer and then losing his sight is just kind of a good testament to his perseverance. And even Daniel touched on the fact that he was still working away while suffering from shingles. And so, as kind of a young academic, that perseverance, that love of economics, the working through adversity. Has been an inspiration, and it's been, at least I think probably all of you see it as well. Sorry, the pun, Jim. But to me, it's been a good inspiration and so forth. So to kind of conclude, Jim's his contributions have been inspiring, and for me personally, as again a young academic. The example you've set, both in research and other folks have touched on in terms of personal life, has been a great example for all of us. So thank you, Jim.
I'm Randy Holcombe, Jim's colleague. I've been Jim's colleague for 31 years, my good fortune. And Joe, following up on that anecdote that you told, for those of us who have been to graduate school, that's probably everybody, I think perseverance is a big part of getting through. And so the point I was making is, if you threw all the first-year students into a pool and the last was asked them to tread water, and then the last people out, those were the people you gave the degrees to, probably be the same people as if you put them through the whole hazing process of graduate school. Yeah, so like I say, it's been my good fortune to have been Jim's colleague for 31 years now. And Jim has been a mentor to me, even as a colleague, and an inspiration to me. And I think actually, at least in part, I have Dick Wagner to thank for the opportunity because Dick was at Florida State and left Florida State, and there was a vacancy there, and they were looking for somebody of public choice. So thanks, Dick. If it wasn't for you, and I wouldn't say I was taking Dick's place, because I don't think anybody could really do that. But I did get that line. I did move in on Dick's line. So it's been great to have Jim as a colleague. We have lunch several times a week. And of course, several of you have commented Jim's blind. But I've never thought of that as a handicap. It's just one of, some people are tall, some people are short. Jim happens to be blind, and so I haven't really thought of it as a handicap, which Jim, I think, will confirm that, because a lot of times after lunch we'll walk back together, back to Jim's office or something. And I'm not shy about saying, well, Jim, let's climb this fence because it's a shortcut. And that's okay. Jim is game with that. So actually, I've been fortunate in my life to have had two Jims as role models and mentors, because I was a dissertation student at Jim Buchanan's. So both of those Jims have been inspirational and role models to me. And it's interesting that they each have similar stories about sort of coming to the ideas of public choice. And those of you who knew Jim Buchanan, and Dick, I think you probably confirm this, many a time I heard Jim Buchanan talk about discovering Wicksell's new principles of just taxation in the Chicago Library. And the way the story goes, as I've heard him tell it many times, and also it's the same story in his autobiography, Better Than Planning, Better Than Plowing. So Jim says, after I'd finished my dissertation, I had a little time left there at the University of Chicago. And of course, I mean, just thinking about your own experience, after you finish up graduate school, you have a few months. I mean, what would you do? I mean, like Jim Buchanan, you go to the library and do some reading in between finishing up. And he said then he ran across Wicksell's New Principles of Just Taxation. It was written in German, but fortunately he read the German. And he said it was a revelation to him that these ideas in Wicksell were like so much more accurate, so much more true than any of the public finance that he had studied before. So it was a revelation to him after he'd finished his dissertation. But actually, and Dick, you might know something about this, but if you look at his dissertation, it references Wicksell's work. So anyways, he's claimed, after I finished my dissertation, I discovered this in the Chicago Library, but it's referenced in his dissertation. I don't know where the disconnect is there between that story that I've heard him tell many times and is in his autobiography and the fact that Wicksell is referenced in his dissertation. But anyways, suppose Buchanan has this revelation. He reads Wicksell and says, wow, I mean, this is, these ideas are so different from what's in contemporary public finance. And Buchanan has claimed, basically my whole career is built upon the ideas that I found there in Wicksell and developed those ideas. And I might also say Dick has a wonderful, like an intellectual biography of Jim's work that came out recently that gives a lot of supporting evidence to this. And Jim Gwartney tells a similar story, that he's a graduate student at the University of Washington, and he had the good fortune of taking a class from Tom Borcherding, who was I guess a colleague of Jim's. I think Tom got his PhD at Duke, but then he had a postdoc at the University of Virginia. Jim said he had a great reading list. And also during that time, Gwartney had invited Buchanan up to give a talk at the University of Washington. And so Jim tells a story similar to the one that Buchanan tells about running into Excel. But in Jim Gwartney's case, it's running into Jim Buchanan. And wow, what a revelation these ideas are. And so Jim's career sort of moves on from there, where he integrates public choice into his Principles of Economics book, but also into his work more general. I think I want to tell you about when I met Jim. So I don't know how many of you remember the first time you met Jim, but I remember the first time that I met him. I don't remember the exact year. It was probably 1977 or 1978 or thereabouts. But it was a Liberty Fund conference that was held in Blacksburg, Virginia. It was a relatively long conference, and the main speakers in the conference were Jim Buchanan and Axel Leyenhofen and Robert Nozick. And so we were there for, I think it lasted a week, if I remember, a week-long conference. Anyways, I remember Jim Buchanan coming to me and saying, "Here's somebody you need to meet." And the person I needed to meet was Jim Gwartney. So I think that's, at least Jim Buchanan hadn't won his Nobel Prize yet at that point, but nevertheless, it's a credit to Jim Gwartney that Jim Buchanan is telling his students, "You need to meet this guy." And so that's when Jim and I met. So we had kept in touch after that. Actually, my wife had gone to Florida State University and got her PhD and wrote a dissertation under Jim Gwartney. That was a couple years before I got there. I think she finished in '86. And then I had the good fortune of Dick Wagner leaving. So I was hired in 1988 there and have been Jim's colleague ever since. I wrote a paper to go along with this session. I'm not really presenting the paper, but I'll talk to you a little bit about what's in the paper. But Jim's, if you look at Jim's career, the bulk of his work has been empirically oriented in labor economics and public sector economics, and of course the Economic Freedom of the World Index, I mean just developing the index, and then there's been a series of empirical papers after that. But if you look at his teaching of public choice, it's really been based more on just simple economic principles. And the paper that I wrote to go along with this session, I titled "Common Sense Public Choice." And that's really Jim's approach to public choice. He just has a common sense approach to public choice. The basic idea behind Jim's public choice is people respond to incentives. And so let's look at the incentives that people face. Let's look at the incentives voters face. Let's look at the incentives that politicians face. And people respond to incentives. And let's just see what the implications are of that. And in his introductory economics textbook, Economics, Private and Public Choice, the public choice sections in that book, of course the book is infused with public choice, but has separate public choice sections, which I did look through some editions of the book as I was putting together my to the front of the book as the book has progressed. So, if we're just thinking about I don't know, the status of public choice or something. It looks like it's moved up in the textbook anyway. But I think it was an innovation and a great thing when Jim wrote that introductory textbook and prominently featured public choice in the title and prominently featured public choice in the book. And I have heard Jim say, he was maybe disappointed, maybe surprised that these public choice ideas didn't take the world by storm. Because they make so much sense once you see them, and that's along the lines of the revelations that Jim Buchanan said he had when he read Wicksell, and that Jim Gwartney said that he had when he came across these ideas of public choice. Once you understand those basic ideas, it seems like, I hardly, it's like you can't unsee them, can you? Although it seems like some people, some people don't, some people in the economics profession, maybe a majority of people in the economics profession haven't caught on to that. But if you look at his introductory textbook, which has done so much to introduce the ideas of public choice, and I think that story about Gordon Tullock, basically other people have imitated that, right? So public choice increasingly, not only in Jim's book, but because of Jim's book, has moved into other areas of economics. And in his Common Sense Economics, there's a lot of public choice in that. And again, it's that common sense public choice. So if you look at public choice as a discipline, there's a lot of theoretical stuff, theoretical voting models, and empirical work that's done, and theorem proving, and that sort of thing. And Jim's approach has really been common sense public choice. Let's just look at the incentives that people face and analyze their behavior the same way, analyze people in the public sector, analyze their behavior the same way we look at the behavior of people in the private sector. That was Jim Buchanan's idea about what distinguishes public choice, and it's Jim Gwartney's idea about what distinguishes public choice. Buchanan's gone, he's done a lot of constitutional stuff and a lot of other stuff, but Jim Gwartney has really been focused on just people respond to incentives. Let's look at the incentives that they face, and we can understand a lot about the way that the public sector works. Jim has been a great salesman for the ideas of public choice. And when we think about some of the founders of public choice, like Buchanan and Tullock and Riker and Olson and Niskanen, what Jim has done is taken those ideas and brought them down to introductory economics students and just infused economics with those public choice ideas. And I hope that we can continue with the success of that. And Joe was talking about looking at what's in the Principles of Economics textbooks. And I've looked a little bit at what's in the public finance, public sector economics textbooks. And one thing that you do see there is there is a public choice chapter in those books. And typically when you see the public choice chapter, it's about essentially government failure, about cyclical majorities and rashly ignorant voters and those sorts of problems. But then if you look at the rest of the book, it's optimal quantity of a public good, optimal corrective taxes on externalities, optimal taxation, that sort of thing. And my observation is, for most of the textbooks, my observation is, if that public choice chapter is right, then the rest of the book is wrong. So anyways, Jim has done a great job of getting those public choice ideas into the classroom. But the challenge is still there, that we need to get some more converts and get people to the point, get other economists to the point where we analyze the public sector with the same tools that we use to analyze private sector resource allocation. And nobody's done a better job of pushing that idea than Jim Gwartney.
Randy always takes me through the tough work.
The obstacles. He takes you through the hedges and so forth.
And the steps where it's easy to fall and that sort of thing. Well, I wasn't sure what to expect, but I'm deeply honored by the comments of all the speakers, and thank you as well for being here. It makes me think a little bit listening to all the nice things you all said about me of the Jerry Seinfeld part when somebody is making some nice comments about him, and he makes the comment, he says, well, maybe my mother was right. so my mother always was very complimentary in talking about how God had great things in mind for my life. So I kind of think of that. I'd like to also note that a number of you mentioned my wife, Amy. She's suffering on a cruise between Australia and New Zealand. So, but certainly a great deal of she has been very supportive of me, and I refer to my wife as being my Lifetime Achievement Award. That we've been, shared lots of ups and downs in life, not all of them joyful, and some of them rather painful, but at least did it together. So it's been a wonderful experience. Now, one of the things I guess I should correct is some of you talked about how, sort of the staying with it and some stick-to-itness, I guess, stuff, and particularly related to my blindness. I almost think of that as being an opportunity cost issue. My opportunity cost is so low because of being blind. So I just keep on doing what I've been able to do. So, but in any case, the blindness is not really all that big a handicap. In fact, sometimes things work better when you're blind. Dave McPherson, a number of you know, and he and I were working together a couple of months ago, and we were taking a break and went in to watch the news, 6 o'clock news on TV. And after we had been there about 10 minutes, Dave said, you realize there's no picture. I said, no. He said, well, I think the picture tube has gone out on your TV. So I thought it might be a good chance to market that TV as a blind, designed for blind people type of TV. So blindness is not always a disadvantage, and there are a lot of more serious disadvantages than being blind. I do really, I'm delighted that this event took place at the Public Choice Society, because public choice has exerted enormous impact upon my economic career. And Randy mentioned that I got interested. I never heard of public choice until I took a graduate class from Tom Gwartney, but it was at the same time when Jim Buchanan was at UCLA, and he came up to the University of Washington and spent 3 days at the University of Washington. And it did strike me, and I was teaching principles already at the University of Washington and loved to teach principle, and had in the back of my mind, even while I was a graduate student, that I want to write a principles textbook. I think I can write one as good. And the one that I really admired, of course, was Alchin and Allen. But it did seem to me that Alchin and Allen was too advanced for a number of students. So I was going to be watered down Alchin and Allen, But it hit me almost instantaneously that we need to integrate public choice into introductory economics. So right from the very beginning of my academic career, when I actually started working as a professional, public choice was a real centerpiece. And it did seem to me, and in fact, if I look back over my career as an economist, the thing that I would be most disappointed about is that public choice has not exerted a greater impact. Now, it has exerted a large impact, and we might, maybe a question whether the glass is half full or half empty. But so we have made some difference, but it seems so commonsensical and so central in terms of importance. You can't really think about economic policy or think about how the world works or how the world ought to work without integrating public choice into your thought process. George Stigler used to tell the story that in economics, when we sort of, talk about how markets work, and that's the only thing that we talk about, and then, the idea of market failure, and therefore maybe it should conclude markets don't work so well, that if that's the only thing you integrate into your economic way of thinking, that George Stigler would say you're like the judge in the singing contest that after hearing the first singer sing, immediately declared the second contestant the winner. So I think that's kind of what a number of people who they look at markets and particularly stressing market failure and all that sort of thing if they don't integrate public choice into their thought, that they're immediately awarding the contest to the second winner, so to speak. Second contestant. Well, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate all of you, and I can't believe some of the wonderful things that my graduate students stated. And I also, I think I should have express my appreciation for the fact that Daniel didn't invite, some of the people who might have some more roasting kind of stories, probably like Dwight Lee and Dick Wagner, for not inviting those guys to be part of the presenters. But if you want to get more of the roasting flavor, if you talk to Dick or Dwight or others, Bill Shugart, who've been around here for a while, they can probably tell you some different side of the stories. But I really appreciate you all being here and the remarks of each one of you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.